The honourable member for Okanagan West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I rise here today to affirm my support to M-148, and I thank the member from Saint-Léonard-Saint-Michel for bringing this forward. And I think there was considerable consensus in this House when we had our initial discussion on this motion back in November. It's truly a positive step. And while it's highly commendable to promote awareness, I wish to use some of my time today to encourage the government to go further. We must do all we can to minimize preventable tragedy and keep our roads safe for Canadians. Driving is not a constitutional right. It's a privilege that must be denied those who act recklessly by driving impaired. We need to give serious consideration to concrete, measurable ways that this behaviour can be deterred and ultimately eliminated. And I'll revisit this a little later. Committing to additional awareness campaigns about the perils of drug, alcohol, and distracted driving is a good place to start. We have seen that these initiatives work. Data from Statistics Canada shows that in 2015, the rate of alcohol-impaired driving was 201 incidents per 100,000 population. That was the lowest rate since data on impaired driving was first collected in 1986, down 65%, and 4% lower than in 2014. After decades of awareness, it's now widely accepted that alcohol-impaired driving is wrong and that it causes considerable harm. But as we move forward towards the legalization of cannabis, we must acknowledge that many individuals do not believe drug-impaired driving is quite so serious. And anything that impairs your reactions and judgment is going to have detrimental effects on your ability to drive. Impairment is impairment. Recently, I heard Dr. Robert Solomon interviewed by CBC's Michael Enright about impaired driving. Dr. Solomon, a legal expert who has done considerable research on impaired driving, also testified at Justice Committee. And he points out 16 to 24-year-olds represent 13% of the population, but account for 1/3 of the cannabis users. Canadian youth are already the leading demographic for rates of impaired driving. The high incidence of cannabis use compared with the already high rate of impaired driving warrants our attention. Additionally, and perhaps most disconcertingly, the perception that drugs will not impair your driving is prevalent among young Canadians. As the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction says, the challenge is many youth do not consider driving under the influence of marijuana to be risky, unlike driving under the influence of alcohol. Some youth even believe that using marijuana makes them better drivers, but evidence clearly shows that it impairs driving ability. More awareness campaigns that centre on youth are needed to deter them from driving while impaired, especially after using marijuana. A national study by the Partnership for a Drug-Free Canada provides further evidence to that effect, writing, nearly 1/3, 32% of teens do not consider driving under the influence of cannabis to be as bad as alcohol. Further to this point, Mr. Speaker, in an article published in the National Post in 2016, I quote, about half of pot-smoking Canadians who get behind the wheel while high believe the drug doesn't impair their ability to drive safely, and 20% said nothing would make them stop driving while stoned. So you can see that an unfortunate number of factors are converging here. We have Canadian youth with already high rates of impaired driving, high cannabis use, and the belief that drugs will not cause impairment. Clearly, this needs to be addressed. Awareness will help, but let us not stop there. Let us also consider measures and practices that will deter impaired driving in all forms. Mr. Speaker, I supported Bill C-46, which, among other measures, which would allow police to administer roadside mandatory alcohol screening, MAS, as a way to apprehend all drivers at the stop who are impaired. Dr. Solomon was quite clear in his testimony on this. Testing every driver at a stop instead of relying on subjective discretion saves lives. It increases the likelihood of an impaired driver being apprehended, and the practice deters impaired driving since drivers know they will be tested. While this practice may give some pause, I reiterate, driving is a privilege and not a constitutional right. MAS is used successfully in many European countries, as is illustrated by the submission to the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights, which Dr. Solomon co-authored. And I quote, "When Switzerland enacted MAS in 2005, the percentage of drivers testing positive for alcohol fell about 25% to 7.6%, and alcohol-related crash deaths dropped by approximately 25%. So folks are less likely to engage in a behavior if they know there is a greater probability of them getting caught. Dr. Solomon's submission to the committee goes on to say, a 2013 study reported that MAS prevented an estimated 5,309 crash deaths in 4 Australian states over a 27-year period, and was particularly effective in reducing crash deaths among 17 to 30-year-olds. Lives are being saved by this practice. The mandatory alcohol screening is no doubt effective, but we are still debating a suitable equivalent for drug-impaired driving. Such a device needs to be reliable, efficient, and ideally inexpensive for police forces. These are the kinds of measures I believe are necessary in order to go further than awareness campaigns. So, Mr. Speaker, I'll conclude by reiterating my support for my honourable colleague's motion. But I also want to remind members that we have a long way to go. We have a long way to go in terms of addressing persistent misconceptions around the harmfulness of drug-impaired driving, and we have a long way to go to implement effective practices that will save Canadian lives. Thank you.
Resuming debate.